first of all, the Royal Commission, as you know, in 1986. There were various people involved in it after that. There was a particular group called the Electoral Reform Coalition. But I just came in personally in about the last 2 or 3 months before the referendum, which was an amazing time. I don't know what you've heard about it, but I'll start that again. The reason I got involved in the referendum was not because I'd had previous experience, but because as the referendum approached, a campaign began from the business opponents of MMP. And I was having a holiday at my sister's house, and I heard advertisement after advertisement after advertisement on the radio and TV, saturation advertising, attacking MMP. And this new group had arrived, which had just the head of the privatised telecom corporation fronting it. They wouldn't say where their money came from, and they were going to win the way they were going. They had the polls were narrowing towards a date where the referendum would occur, and so I and some of my friends volunteered to run the campaign for them. So for the last 2 or 3 months, I was the national campaign manager for the campaign that was getting MMP.
Okay. So you really felt strongly about bringing MMP to New Zealand, or was it more that you felt strongly that shouldn't be decided by a barrage of television advertisements?
My personal initial motivation was the concern that a large-scale public relations campaign with lots of money was going to decide it rather than citizens. But I also had probably what would be called a very general view, which lots of New Zealanders shared in 1993, which was that we weren't being well served by a two-party state, and that people wanted to break out of that. So it wasn't a very careful analysis of the options, but it was a wish for change.
Okay. Do you think that you were alone, or in that assessment, that it was, or that everybody kind of wished for change during that time?
A large majority of the public wanted change. We had been through the most disillusioning, tempestuous period of our modern politics, which was a Labour government which acted far more right-wing than its predecessor national government had been. This was the Labour government of the 80s, introduced sort of Reaganomics kind of policies into New Zealand in a covert way, steamrolled them through, lost huge public support doing it. Then a national government coming and promising to change that.
Could we pause for a second? Sorry, just the noise of that plane was quite interfering.
Right, we've got an airport there, so we're going to have quite a plane probably.
Oh, yeah.
We'll just keep going.
Well, I need to start something. Shall I go back to?
If you could explain a little bit about the political climate of the 1993 election.
Yeah. 1993 was a really, sorry, start again. For the New Zealand public, 1993 was sort of rock bottom in New Zealand politics. It was a time of disillusionment and disappointment with politicians. It was the worst I've ever seen. And it was a natural consequence of the 1980s, where we'd had a hopefully positive new Labour government, which had been far more right-wing than the Conservative National Party, introducing Reaganomic kind of policies. And then the National Party had come back promising to stop what Labour had been doing, and made them even worse. It was cutting benefits for people and privatising health and generally attacking lots of things which New Zealanders regard as foundations of their country. And so probably the main motivation for MMP wasn't a careful calculation of electoral systems. It was just a belief that we'd been so poorly formed by the two-party system that anything had to be better.
So, could you tell me about some of your day-to-day experiences as part of the Electoral Reform Coalition? When you were,
I wasn't part of the Electoral Reform Coalition.
You weren't part of that. You were, but you said you were.
But I worked for them for a while. My day-to-day experiences were that the MMP referendum had arisen in some ways almost by accident. It wasn't a great plan of the National Party. They'd made commitments, sort of talked themselves into it. And now they had a referendum which most of the politicians didn't want, especially in the National Party. Labour politicians weren't very happy with it either. They were happy with the two-party system. The business lobbies were extremely unhappy with the potential for change. And so they were all ganged up on the public, who were inclined to have a change. And it was a really historic showdown between sort of the old vested interests of the political and business community and the ordinary public, who were tired of the way things had been. And what that meant for me at the time was, although I wasn't highly involved in the issue of MMP, I got involved in the politics of helping the public to win, because you had millions of dollars on one side and a concerned but disorganised public on the other. And the proof, to my way of thinking, of how strong that feeling was, that once they were organised, once people were offered ways to participate, ask for their money, ask to write things, to turn out on the streets, to wear messages, to carry messages, the feedback was enormous. And all the small towns and all the big cities around the country, it was an outpouring of support for us, which is why the referendum was eventually successful. But it didn't happen on its own. And so my role was to help catalyse the public feeling against the very well-organised, well-funded business lobby.
Okay. Were you writing at that time, professionally?
No, that was before I was writing professionally. In fact, I was working on my first book at the time and took a gap from the first book to help.
So, after MMP was passed in 1993, when did you hear about that? Where were you on election night in 1993?
We were having a celebration. We were having a celebration at the offices of the people who'd been working for MMP, where we had very good spokespeople, and by then we had a large collection of people helping. So it was a very dramatic moment. You could tell that New Zealand had fundamentally changed on that night. You could see it on the faces of our side and the public, and you could see it on the faces of the business lobbies. Everyone knew something big had happened.
Did you expect as much resistance from the government as it did? I mean, the campaign for First Past the Post with Helen Clark, and I forget the name of the National Party representative of that, but it wasn't just big business. It was also the entrenched politicians.
It was politicians who were used to wielding power in a certain way, and not wanting to have to, who thought that they mightn't have power all the time, but when they had it, they wanted it absolutely. And so they didn't want to change on that, and they didn't change on it willingly. It was one of those really unusual and wonderful moments where all the normal powerful things which would normally determine things were beaten by the ordinary public.
Do you think that the fact that the powerful were so, as you said, it was a barrage of campaign ads on television? Do you think that backfired against them, that their support of the First Past the Post system really turned people off from First Past the Post?
No, that would actually be, unfortunately, that would be the wrong story to take from it. They alienated a lot of people by their campaign. They got a lot of people angry, who were the people that we were able to catalyse into a campaign once we got organised. But no, they weren't aiming for those people. It was actually a classic American politics inspired campaign of negative advertising. The aim of it was to put some people off voting and to scare other people. In fact, we managed to get a copy of one of their main strategy documents and publicised it in the midst of the campaign, where they were saying that people they were aiming for were essentially the dumb voters. That's how they put it. They described what they saw as the dumb voters, the people who didn't think hard about the issues, and they set out to try to scare, unsettle, generally put off those people from wanting to take a bold stand. And our whole campaign had to be reassuring those people that their first instinct, which was that they were unhappy with the way things were, was the one they should follow.
Can we just pause for a second? Rolling.
So you said while the tape was being changed that the right-wing lobbies started using MMP?
One of the great ironies of this is that the MMP came in 1993, the first election was to be 3 years later. One of the main organisations that used it was a new right-wing grouping of precisely the people and the funders who'd been the anti-MMP campaign. This was forming a party called the ACT Party. It was to be a free market party to the right of all the existing New Zealand politics. The campaign manager for that organisation, the new ACT Party, had been the campaign manager of the anti-MMP campaign, and what they did was they set up to use MMP as a new vehicle to push for their policies. So they were the first most expedient ones to jump on the bandwagon and try and use the new system again to drag politics across in the direction that they've been working for.
Do you think ACT's changed much from those early days?
Oh yeah, it's faded out practically. The reason it got into politics was one of the striking moments of New Zealand election finance history is when the results came in from that first MMP election in 1996. And contrary to what anyone would have expected, the party which spent the most was this tiny new, never before seen party called the ACT Party, the far right one, which, and even just in its declared funding, which was only a fraction of what it spent, had spent more than the big parties, practically both the big parties put together. It spent an enormous sum for New Zealand politics. And by that, by saturation advertising, just as they'd done 3 years ago against the referendum, they used this money to propel several MPs into Parliament to get themselves going in the new MMP environment. As it happened, money isn't enough in politics, and eventually that wore out for them. And now the party is, 10 years later, is pretty much disintegrating.
Okay. What about the left wing? There was an alliance between the Green Party and the Progressives.
Yes. On the other side of politics, particularly the Green Party grew at that stage. A party called the Alliance began, and by the second MMP election, the Alliance had a large number of MPs. That was all the groupings to the left of the Labour Party, you might call it left of the main centre-left party, had joined and were a major force in Parliament, which was Greens and Democrats, sort of old left kind of people. So yeah, what happened was a very rapid rearrangement of politics at that time. In fact, if you look at that moment of 1993, which is where it began, a whole lot of things happened very quickly. MMP came in. The main figurehead of the right-wing campaign in the National Party, a woman called Ruth Richardson, lost her job and left politics. The main figurehead of the continuing right-wing part of the Labour Party, a politician called Mike Moore, lost his job to Helen, who's now the Prime Minister. That MMP moment and the shift of politics that happened around it, it will affect New Zealand for a generation after, probably, because we're living in the landscape that was formed over a few months then.
So in 2005, the National Party waged a ultimately unsuccessful campaign to be either the government or lead the next government. And you wrote a book about some of their tactics. Could you tell me and the audience a little bit about that book?
Ask me a more specific question, actually, please. Might help.
Could you tell me a little bit about National's tactics in 2005?
Yeah. During 2004, 2005, I was researching a book on the National Party, which initially had relatively limited aspirations. It was looking at their policies on Maori and race particularly. But I found contacts inside the party who were very unhappy with where it was going, who eventually leaked me thousands of internal documents, their strategy papers, their overseas election consultants, and also things like their donors and the third-party groups who were secretly campaigning for them. And so I was able to write a book which documented in their own words, chapter after chapter, how a modern election campaign works. And this is essentially Western Conservative Party campaigns, since they all borrow each other's consultants and policies. What I really found was the inside story for why ordinary people feel the way they do about politics. It started off with the calculated way that politicians were being coached in not talking about the real issues, dodging issues which might be unpopular, hiding issues which they knew wouldn't get them votes, emphasising things that they didn't care about because they thought that what they called the dumb punters might go along with them, with those policies. I was able to document the foreign consultants who came in and talk about ways to manipulate people's emotions and fears and resentments, and actually had copies of their research, their focus groups, and how they mined people's insecurities and worked out particular words and sets of ideas that they might use to manipulate people at crucial times. This is tactics which are seen in other countries just as much, but I could actually expose them and show them here. Showed generally the whole cynical way that the kind of tactics that repel politics were being deliberately executed, not so much by the politicians, but by a sort of small army of unpaid strategists and speechwriters and media managers and people like that, who are the real drivers of a modern political party like that. The other thing I found out, the other thing I got documents of, was finding out who was funding the National Party, because New Zealand has had a quite almost uniquely opaque election finance system. up until now, which means that all the big donors who've wanted to remain secret have remained secret. And what I found was that the National Party, which at that time was promoting itself as the party of mainstream New Zealanders, for mainstream New Zealanders, was being funded by about 10 or 12 extremely unpopular names from New Zealand politics. These were the far-right big businessmen of the 1980s and 90s who got rich in the years when New Zealand was privatised and deregulated, who were the beneficiaries of very unpopular policies, who'd used their wealth from that time to try to influence politics ever since, and they were essentially underwriting the so-called mainstream party. And not only that, there were other groups which the National Party would never wanted to have been associated with publicly, from the far right of the Christian area, including the Exclusive Brethren, who were spending over $1 million on secret advertising without admitting it was for and arranged with the National Party, and other sorts of business lobby groups who were also buying their share of future policy by helping the National Party. So what I was able to do is that rare thing of showing the public everything that was going on behind a party, whereas what people normally get and what repels them from an election and politics is the carefully prepared words and the carefully prepared smart answers and the evasions and things which are the normal diet that you get if you just get the ordinary daily media.
Do you think that the National Party formed a strategy with MMP in mind in 2005?
No. The Nationals policy in 2005 was a bulldozer policy, really. It was, they had by far the most money, they had very powerful allies who were doing campaigning for them in sort of covert, parallel ways. They had the best consultants money could buy, they had the best voter organising strategies and equipment that you could get in the world. And they thought that they could push through, and just by force of money and will, that they would win the election. But they hadn't calculated for MMP. And so, first of all, they didn't get as many votes as they hoped, but secondly, they hadn't planned on the fact that MMP is not a first-past-the-post system. They had to have allies, parties that they could coalesce with, which they didn't manage to pull together. And of course, even today, it's still their problem.
I read something in the New Zealand, was it the New Zealand Herald? I'm not sure, but they were talking about how National was leading in the polls, but that might not matter because the magic numbers, as they say, is around 45 for National, but around 40 for the Labour Party.
Yes. In New Zealand, the chances of any party getting over 50% and ruling alone, it may be their dream, but it's not going to be their reality. That in fact, there's a natural process that during the period between elections, the main parties get the main amount of publicity. They're the main actors, they get the main support, or the main stated support in polls. As the election approaches, people look at the smaller parties, the third parties, and they get more interested in those, and so the big parties drop and the other ones rise. And so luckily under our system, there's a necessity to form coalitions of small parties, and so one which is trying to bulldoze its way there on its own has miscalculated. That won't be enough on its own.
Do you think that Nationals learned its lessons from 2005 and that they've changed tactics, or that they've changed who they associate with, or how do you think that they've changed in the past 3 years?
The National Party will be thinking very hard about coalition problems. Have they changed? They haven't changed fundamentally in how they're going to campaign, I'd say. The things I documented for the 2005 election will be repeated in the 2008 one, I'm sorry to say. But they will have thought very hard about how to form coalitions. And for example, they have been rather disingenuously and non-credibly trying to have a friendly relationship with the Maori Party in New Zealand, which is really doomed to never work into its way to a stable relationship. They still have hopes that the ACT Party will stay around a bit longer, and they are trying, I suspect, behind the scenes to look at other options like perhaps a Christian party, but they haven't got it sussed yet. There's not a clear path into government for them yet.
Okay. You said that New Zealand is one of the freer countries in the world in the at the rally. Could you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah. We live in the south of the South Pacific, away from many of the world's conflicts and crises. We have traditions of non-violence, which means that serious political violence is extremely unlikely in our country. And so we're just not through any cleverness of the current leadership or policies of the country, but just by history, we're lucky to be a very safe and open and free country. That's of course not the same as being a fair country necessarily, or an equal country or a just country. We have problems in terms of inequality between races. We have problems in terms of inequality of economic power, which were accentuated through the free market reforms that we had in the 80s and 90s, which have created stresses where a country, like all countries, which have got problems. But in terms of basic freedom and peacefulness, that is safety to walk down the street and to people to express opinions, New Zealand is an outstanding country compared to all other parts of the world.
Even compared to the United States?
We're a vastly freer country than the United States. Yes.
Would you say that when people in politics and the police who are accountable eventually to the government which administrates them, are they held accountable in New Zealand? And, well, first of all, are they held accountable in New Zealand?
Things like accountability of police and workability of public systems is a matter of degree. Some of our systems are pretty good in New Zealand. We've got virtually no overt corruption in our bureaucracy and our police force. We've come very near the top of the transparency and the openness of government measures in the world. We're I think we are the number one least corrupt country. And so a lot of our systems work well, but we're not a perfect country by any means. Inside, there's always a tension in any bureaucracy, in any government, between the democratic and the openness and the freedom of speech kind of issues, and the expediency of the people who are running it. It's easier to run a bureaucracy and a government with secrecy. It's easier not to tell people things which look bad. It's easier for the police to cut corners sometimes, which they do, and it takes the whole of it takes a lot of effort by lawyers and the legal system to catch up with when they do that. So it's not a perfect system, but I think we've got a country which has got the potential to reach just outcomes and most of the time act soundly. We don't have a foolproof set of safeguards, but we usually get there.
Do you think MMP has helped or changed the level of corruption? Do you think that Do you think that MMP has, in essence, made the country a little bit less corrupt than it would have been under first past the post?
I'm not sure of the answer to that, actually. The thing about a system like MMP is that it's only one factor of what makes this country like it is, and it's only a very recent factor. Most of our politicians are pre-MMP politicians. They still think like they did on first past the post. Most of our institutions have nothing to do with whether we have MMP or first past the post, and our history, which in that magical way is what determines what people think is right and wrong, and the peacefulness of the country and the justice and the traditions of it. That all happened before MMP. That would happen whatever system we've got. So MMP is just one part of why things are the way they are. I think it's pretty hard. You could make generalisations saying MMP did this or that, but there's so many other factors involved. It would be unwise. There are some things which were clearly do seem to have changed because of MMP, but all the rest of it would be pretty wild generalisations, I think.
So what has clearly changed because of MMP?
I think most people would say that our parliament is more diverse. That we used to have, under a two-party system, we had one party which got farmers and lawyers and sort of the old boys network of towns, and the other party which had teachers and lawyers and public servants and the more left people who came through the Labour Party. But there wasn't a great deal of diversity. There are far more women and Maori and younger people and different people in Parliament now, and that is a huge advantage of MMP. And the practical results of that, I don't think we'll actually see most of them for a generation or more. That these things, that you can see the physical effects, but the real long-term effects will take ages to happen. The other big effect of MMP, undeniable effect, is a mixed bag, and that is that it's harder to change things. And that's actually what the public wanted after a decade where there was a sense of the country having been hijacked by the far right and privatisation and steamrolling through of cutting of social services and the things that led up to the MMP decision. People didn't want things to change as much. And so if you're a business lobby, you don't like MMP because it makes it harder to buy a government and to push through your agenda. But also, if you want something which, if I want something to happen which I think is good, it's also harder because there's more negotiation, it's harder to form a majority. If you get the government on, you're the leading party of the government on your side, it doesn't mean that they're going to get a policy through. And so everyone's slowed up. That's definitely happened as well. And it's good or bad depending on the issue and depending on the week.
Okay. Now, would you say that journalists at the time treated the issue fairly? That they were able to basically do a good job of explaining the issue to people, and that people got good information?
At the time of the MMP referendum?
Yeah.
Do you know what? To be perfectly honest, I can't remember properly. I'd have to look at the clippings. Can't remember.
What about journalism in New Zealand today? Does it typically do a good job at covering the nuances of MMP, or do they still kind of cover it like it's a first past the post election?
No, I think to be fair, we do not have a fantastically high standard of journalism in this country. 4 million people do not support a great diversity of media outlets and types of journalism. And it's the nature of a small country. We're the size of a medium-sized city in some parts of the world. And so we're not going to have brilliant journalism. But yeah, people have adapted, and most of the time, we don't get reporting as if we've got a two-party country. There's more voices, there's more faces, there's an understanding that issues have to be negotiated. And it has only been a decade. People are still learning. A change like MMP, I think it will be decades from now that people will be able to write the definitive analysis on what it did, because then it will actually, I think you'll be able to see big and long-term results of it.
So 15 years on, and by the time this movie is finally edited, it'll be 15 years. 15 years on, it's too early to tell?
Yeah, because in reality, politics changes slowly. It changes slowly because people change slowly. If you've got politicians who spent half their career in the old system and half their career in the new one, they're products of their pasts. So are the institutions products of the past. So are the business lobbies products of the past. The public, most of the people, think in the old ways and have trouble even thinking in an MMP way yet. And so you can't expect something which is not a quick change and a quick fix, but it's sort of a fundamental long-term change. You can't expect it to have its results overnight. But I think each year that goes by and each decade that goes by, people who look at it closely will see the subtle ways that things are different than they would have been.
I think that's all my questions. Helen, did I forget anything, or?
One thing that I wanted to... Alright,
Okay.
rolling.
Yeah.
Alright, so how are you involved in the early days of MMP?
Well, at that time I was working full-time as a writer, and I was very much like lots of citizens here, that I wasn't particularly even very interested or knowledgeable on the MMP issue. But when I saw the huge business lobby campaign to try to stop it, I became concerned that the decision was going to be made by money. So I was one of various people who decided to get involved just late in the piece. I stopped my work at the time, I stopped the writing I was doing, and I offered to help organise the campaign for them, organise the campaign in favour of MMP. So I was there in the midst of the months where we were fighting the business lobby and trying to organise the public into feeling confident enough to change.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. You ready to ask the?
When you say sound bites, how short?
So the first one, and I'll ask you to direct your answer to
Yeah,
Brian,
sure.
is the repeal of section 59. What was that exactly?
Right. Okay, let me think for a moment.
Actually, let me sneeze.
Yes, good.
Oh, I'm good. Sorry. Okay, I'm good now.
All right. One of our biggest controversies in recent years was an initiative by the Green Party and then the government to try to stop child abuse, where parents were legally allowed to discipline their children with force. And that became a huge controversy because it was called the anti-smacking bill by its opponents. It polarised the country with a lot of very ignorant opposition and defence on both sides, but eventually went through, and now it's illegal for parents to hit their children.
Do you think that MMP that came as a consequence of MMP?
No, the Section 59 child abuse bill was probably harder under MMP, if anything, because although the Green Party was involved in this case, and before MMP, if the Labour government had decided to do it, they would have had the numbers, and they would have done it, and there wouldn't have been a fight. The difference here was that there were more parties involved, vigorous and pretty ignorant campaign, and so it took a lot of negotiation to get it through.
That actually brings up a good point. You said that it's harder to get things passed. Do you think politics has become, if anything, more in the public eye? The idea that there are more controversies now because it's harder to pass legislation?
Yes and no. The default position in a country like ours and in many Western countries is that decisions are made without becoming public controversies. Most people never hear about all kinds of economic and social and bureaucratic issues, and they're negotiated with a few so-called stakeholders, which means powerful groups, big organisations, business lobbies, and the public doesn't get a look in. So that's actually the normal position. But yes, and under our system, as soon as an issue becomes controversial, you've got more voices, more parties, more positions, that takes a lot more wrangling and negotiation to reach an outcome. So for the issues that do reach the public, you get a better process.
Some people that we've talked to would say that Section 59 the repeal of Section 59 would only have been put through by the Greens. What do you think about that?
What? How do you mean?
That only the Green Party would put through Section 59, so it would never have happened without MMP because there would be no Green Party in Parliament.
No, I don't think that's correct. Do you want to ask me that on?
That's okay.
No, I'll tell you what I would say. That is a classic policy that the previous Labour, Section 59 was a classic policy of the former Labour government before we had MMP. Which was economically right-wing but socially liberal. And I could quite imagine that would have come up through the ranks of the Labour Party, been adopted by the whole government, and pushed through without very much opposition in those days. So no, but there are some policies. There are some policies which are strongly Green Party policies, for example, which wouldn't have arisen otherwise, and then reached the mainstream by their agreements with the Labour Party or whoever they coalesced with, but probably not Section 59.
Okay. And thanks for doing this. Could you do the same sort of synopsis of what happened in the Eurowares?
Right.
Sorry,
Well,
and I know it's hard to
that'd be a
get
little
that down
bit
to
might
10
be a little bit
seconds.
more than a yeah.
I'll try my best, okay?
Thank you.
Right. Right. New Zealand's just had its first major sort of war on terror incident where the police and the security forces thought they found a group of political people, Maori people, practicing with guns and preparing for terrorist acts in a mountain range called the Uruwera Mountains. It's since, like many so-called terrorism discoveries around the world, turned out to be very much less than that. The general view is now that the police seriously overreacted and that some people may have played with guns in the mountains, but it was not going to turn into terrorism.
Okay.
That's so
Cool.
brief as to be nothing much, sorry. Though.
Yeah, no, that was pretty cool.
Okay.
But do you think that MMP has any bearing on that? Not really.
No.
Yeah.
No, because you see, security issues are the kind which aren't susceptible to something like MMP very much. At the moment, our security laws are mostly Labour and National Party working together. In other words, the old party, more conservative politicians are scared to take anything other than a very conventional position on security. And so it's like a grand coalition of the two large parties working together. So the rest of the parties, the rest of the rag bag of MMP doesn't even get a look in.
That is kind of weird. You mentioned that that for the most part, internationally, everywhere except the United States, the United States-led war on terror is sort of debunked. It isn't really considered a real, based on any real truth, and yet, you still have politicians voting for these security positions, which may, and you say it like they're defaulting to that position. Wouldn't they default to the other position if the war on terror has been debunked?
Yeah. For the first few weeks after September 11, 2001, all around the world people took terrorism very seriously. And then apart from in the United States, the evidence started to go the other way. And I'd say in most countries now there's very little credibility to the idea that the war on terror is about terrorism. It doesn't have public credibility. And yet, bizarrely, in a country like New Zealand, which is liberal on these issues, and where people are extremely sceptical that, for example, the invasion of Iraq was to do with terrorism, our bureaucrats, our security chiefs, are acting as if their main priority in life is to fight the war on terror. Now, to understand this in a small country like New Zealand, you have to see that it's not actually about the issues at all. I think if you privately took those security officials aside and asked them what they think about Iran and Iraq and whether or not the US is making the world safer from terrorism or more dangerous at the moment, they would think the same as most of their fellow citizens in New Zealand, which is that the whole thing's gone mad. What happens in a country like New Zealand is that the war on terror has actually become something quite different. It's like a code word for friendly relationships with the United States. In other words, if you want trade, if you want to continue diplomatic links, if you want to have a friendly long-term relationship with the US, you have to talk war on terror. And so that's pretty much where a little country like New Zealand is.
That's interesting.
Electoral finance next?
Yes, please. Thanks.
Okay.
Wasn't very soundbite-ish though, sorry, I forgot that.
Don't worry. Don't worry. If it comes from your heart, it isn't going to matter.
Yeah.
So, it's more important to get what you really feel is an issue, even if it's nuanced, than it is to just get the soundbite.
Mm.
So, but yes, could you explain a little bit about the current controversy with the electoral finance bill?
Yeah. Currently, do you not want to currently in this, do you? Because it will be out of date, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
New Zealand's been looking at revising our very poor election finance laws, and this is a classic case of where MMP doesn't serve us well. I'm a strong advocate of improving the transparency and the openness and the limits on big money in our elections, but when it came to trying to push the law through, rather than the government, which is quite committed to change, this is the Labour government, being able to just push it through, because of MMP they had to find allies to do that. And there's been pressure on the different third parties, the different coalition partners and sort of friendly parties of the government, which has meant that it's been a torrid and difficult process to get the law through. And the first past the post, they would have made a decision and they would have done it. This is one of those cases where there's something good that someone like me would like to go through, and the breaks that go on policy from MMP are actually being a disadvantage.
Prostitution reform was the other one.
And I don't know too much about that. So.
Yeah, and that wasn't really very MMP issue. Okay,
No.
well I'll just tell you about it, okay? Another recent issue in New Zealand was reform of the prostitution laws, which was essentially to stop it being illegal for someone to get a prostitute. Not saying that people thought it was a fantastic thing to be going on in society, but simply that it was a mad thing for the police to be spending their time arresting people for. Now this was actually the opposite of some of the other cases, which is that this would have gone ahead whether or not we had MMP. It was promoted by a government MP. It was pushed through Parliament with the backing of the government. They had to get agreement from elsewhere, but I think it would have gone through perfectly well without MMP, and it also went through with MMP because they could mobilise enough people to support them. So that's one which would have gone through easier without MMP, but still was okay with MMP because of the alliance of parties that were working together.
Cool, thanks for doing
So I'm just
that.
that's all right, just trying to explain
Yeah.
different issues have different results.
Yeah.
I think I'm done with the questions if you are.
Yep, I'm done.
Okay. I think we're ready to pack up unless you wanted to add
No, I
something.
don't think I've got anything else, no.
Okay.
Good.
Cool. Thanks so much for your time. It's been
Sure.
really, really good.
Oh, good.
Yep.
Okay.
And we'll let you know via email at the time of distribution what exactly is going to
What's
be
going to
happening
happen?
with
Good. Yes.
Yeah.
Are you going to be working from 2 different countries on this?
it. Mm.
Yeah, I'm gonna. First of all, one of the reasons why we have the backup audio is because if, with the exception of the interview we did kind of off the cuff with Nandor, we have all the audio. We can send that MP3 file down a lot faster. We can start working on the transcripts and kind of edit from paper before we start editing. But eventually, I'm gonna digitize everything, put it on a hard drive, send the hard drive in the mail because it'll be about 500 gigabytes, and not gonna happen with the broadband connections here. And I totally agree with you. If just looking at Telecom New Zealand, I don't think that privatization of telecom was a good move.
We got done.
Helen,
All right, I'll just wait until she's up the
Do you want to do
stairs.
something? Do you have to do a sync with that or something?
afterwards.
It's done. Do you believe that for people in interest groups, do you think that there is more of an opportunity for involved people to get to affect real change? And if so, is that more true under MMP than under First Past the Post?
Again, MEP is just one factor. I would say in a society like ours, which is free and people can organise and it's small and well mixed, I know in our country people can have a huge influence over politics. The main thing is... Shit.
I'm a little bit thrown by that use of that phrase in that way, but yeah.
Okay.
Which phrase?
Kill 2 birds with 1 stone.
Have you not heard that?
No.
Oh, okay. Anyway, we're rolling.
All right. For the final time, hopefully.
Yes.
Do you believe that that interest groups, interested citizens, can affect change in New Zealand, and does MMP have anything to do with that?
Yeah, I know. I strongly believe, and my experience tells me, that people can make a huge difference to politics in this country. When people get organised, when people talk about issues, when they get well informed, when they work together, we've got a history from the beginning of European settlement up till now of changes being brought about by people. In fact, the history of our country is in a way a struggle between the sort of non-democratic power of the business groups and the landowners and the people who came to this country to build the kind of future that they wanted. And right throughout our history, you've got example of those people building the society on the principles and vision that they came here for. So I strongly believe in that. How's MMP contributed to that? As I've said, it slows down the whole process in some ways. And that's what people wanted from it. But it's still just as possible. And it adds another dimension, which is that because political change happens, it starts in the community, it starts with spearhead groups, it starts with outspoken people or researchers or with people, catalysts for change. At the stage where it gets through to the Parliament, there's more potential there. There's different sorts of people, there's more voices, there's shifting coalitions which make things possible at times when they weren't previously possible. And so I'd say that overall, that's helped us even more.
All right. That seems to be it. And for real it this time. So.
Okay.